So, and I guess just to bridge over to the final contribution, I think what you just said, Leslie, needs, I can repeat, you know, we are bringing in now a very different perspective again from Klaus Mindrup, who is a Berlin-based parliamentarian and originally trained as a biologist, but has been a very keen and prolific speaker on urban topics in recent years, and a great supporter also of Bauhaus Earth. So we are really happy that you are here, Klaus. And you will talk about another perspective, bringing, I think, much more foregrounding the role of state and regulatory intervention, and bring that into our discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I will start with three remarks. First of all, I will talk from a Western perspective, but I will never forget my roots. My father was born 87 years ago in a hut in the northern part of Germany, in a family of farmhands and in a hut without electricity. It was even possible in the 30s in Germany, and it's never, I will forget this, even as I was a child, many, we had, I don't know the word in English, it's Plumpsklo of German, we had a toilet without water, so never forget it, and never ever, I said to me, be a Western arrogant person because of the history of my family. The second remark is, you see here, I'm a senior associate at E3G in Washington, DC, but I joined E3G only 2 weeks ago, so many of my colleagues at E3G never met me, so I'm really a new one. So if you ask someone at E3G about me, don't wonder if they don't know me. And the third remark is about my career in politics. It ended, I'm not sure if it's definitely end, but it ended last year. And I was 8-year member of the German parliament. And as a member of parliament, your mission as a member of parliament is regulation. You have to deal with regulation. And my problem is I really don't love regulation. So I'm an ecologist and not a lawyer. So to be a legislator, it was very interesting for me. And sometimes I held a speech in parliament and I said to my colleagues, we should not try to change the laws of physics. We should concentrate on the man-made law. But to be honest, I wasn't successful in every detail. But let's start the presentation. Every regulation has to be in a good, every regulation and has to be a twin to motivation. And this is this famous quote of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. If you want to build a ship, don't drum the men together, would divide the work and give orders, instead teach them to yearn to the vast and endless sea. And I think we are all here together because we want a climate-friendly world. We want a good world for the people who live in the next decades. And so this is a really big motivation for regulation and for me. So my focus of my presentation will be on CO2 because this is very important, as we heard today in many of the speeches. And to be honest, I have to analyze the weaknesses of our regulation we have in the moment, and it's almost on a European and German perspective. But the first thing I want to mention is really a worldwide problem. The Paris Agreement is really, really important. I was in Paris, and it was a fantastic moment. Then the hammer of the foreign minister of France fall down, and so unbelievable. But there are some weaknesses in the Paris Agreement, and I want to mention two. The first is that exports and imports are attributed to the producing country. This is the source principle. For one example, Germany in the last year didn't fulfill its goal in the power sector. One reason for this is that Germany was an exporter of 5.6 terawatt of power, also electricity, to France, because our French neighbors had a lot of problems with nuclear power plants, and sometimes only 50% of the nuclear power plants were run. And so the coal power plants in Germany had to run because we had to stabilize the grid in France. And these emissions are counted on the German balance sheet. But it's the same with the production from China we import. So very important if you think about regulation under the Paris Agreement, this is a big problem. And a bigger problem is that there is no effective regulation of maritime shipping and aviation over sea and land, and because they are not belonging to states, because the Paris Agreement addresses states. And we have territories that don't belong to states. And this is really, on my perspective, a nightmare, because you can ship products from countries to Europe or to other countries, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the ship uses the dirtiest diesel in the world available, and normally they use it. So big problem, and even a problem for every regionalized production in every state in the world. This is one fundamental pillar of globalization, and we have to change this, but this is really complicated. So the source principle, and this is my first conclusion, alone is insufficient. So sorry. I had not a lot time to sleep. You know what I mean. The problem is this encourages deindustrialization and the reduction of production to minimize the carbon footprint. When you are a politician in Germany and you have your CO2 footprint and you have your balance sheet and you have to report every year, and you know that imports don't count, so well, maybe it's better to reduce the production in your home country when you are focused on CO2. On the worldwide perspective, this is doesn't make any sense, because on a worldwide perspective, you have to look at the worldwide balance sheet. And then we have the problem with the ETS, it's the emission trading system in Europe. We have the carbon leakage regulation, and 90% of the CO2 emissions the industry in Europe don't have to pay for. So these are free permits. They are because the industry has to be protected from industry for other countries. But this means in the region of Europe, steel and cement are privileged over timber, because they are cheaper, because they don't have to pay for the CO2 emissions. Big problem, the carbon leakage problem. And then the source principle is connected with another principle. This is that you think in the sectors, and the President of Europe mentioned the sectors, and the counting of the emissions from the housing sector emissions are much too low. They are really higher if you look at another principle. And if you look in the German report, there are only 52% of greenhouse gases connected to the housing sector, but this is, I think, 2.5 more. So it's factor, it's mass, it's a wrong diagnosis we have here. And this is because there's no life cycle assessment for the building sector under the source principle. It's 40%, we heard today very often. So this is a big problem. If you have the wrong diagnosis, you don't find the right measures. And this is all dependent on international way of thinking. Next. So if we want to have a good regulation framework, we have to come to a life cycle assessment. It's the right approach. So I think we need a double entry accounting. we know it from other, we know it from the economy. So we have, on the one hand, we have to look at the source principle because it's for reporting of a nation is very important. And on the other hand, we have to use the polluter pays principle. So if we look from both perspectives, we will find the right approach, the right measures. So carbon accounting under the greenhouse gas protocol, it's from the industry side, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, leads us to effective action. Very important. We have to change the perspective. If we don't do it, we won't succeed. For the housing sector, this holistic approach leads us to different measures. So city planning, we heard about it, for mixed cities to reduce transportation. Normally, if we would only see it from the perspective of the German climate law, and I was the negotiator for the climate law, people will say, this is the transport sector, but it depends on the housing sector. So the next is integrated production of food and community gardens in the cities. It's the agriculture sector, if you have the sectoral approach. Or, very important, power production. We heard about the power production, the examples from Denmark and other countries. Power production, decentralized consumption and storage, the power sector, another sector. It's really a silo thinking we do at the moment. And the use of organic materials, as we heard, very, very important in the moment, counted under the industry sector. But if we look at all these measures and have an holistic approach, the building sector could solve the problems, as we heard in the speech of John Schellnhuber, but we have to change our way of thinking and we have to change our way of regulation. So the next aim is, we always discussed in the politics in Germany and even in Europe and even on the climate conferences, we have to be net zero. But we heard today, net zero is not enough. The IPCC says we need negative emissions to reach the 2-degree goal and 1.5-degree goals. So if the goal isn't correct, the measures are not correct. So for the future, we need a mix, and this is for the whole world. We need a mix of carbon neutral materials and carbon positive materials, like timber. We heard there are many other alternatives to reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere. So the goal has to be climate positive. And there's the question, why don't we learn from the regulation in the automotive sector? And this was the idea from California, the idea of a fleet regulation. And the Europeans copied it. It's not this regulation made the electric motors possible. When you go to the museum of GM, I think it's GM, in Detroit, you can see vehicles, battery electric vehicles from 1819, so 130 years old. So this is an old technique, and the electric motors are much more efficient than every combustion engine, factor 3 to 5. So, but the progress wasn't made. But after the regulation in California and after the regulation in Europe came in, every auto manufacturer had to think about battery electric cars, electric motors, and yesterday the European Parliament made the decision that after 2035, every new vehicle in Europe has to have an electric motor. So this is a clear regulation, and this clear regulation works. So why don't we learn from this regulation? And most important is we have to be faster in the regulation, the fleet regulation. There were a lot of loopholes in the last decades, but now I think they found every loopholes, and so we have a good regulation on this sector at the moment. So it's always a question of the alternatives. We have alternatives. We heard it today. These are 3 alternatives from Germany. We can have low carbon and carbon positive houses. The left picture is from Munich. In the middle is from Berlin, and on the right side is from Berlin too. And on the right side is very interesting. It's a cooperative. I could talk hours about cooperatives because I'm a member of a cooperative movement in Berlin, and this is a cooperative who constructed this house in the middle of Berlin, in the district of Berlin-Mitte. It's a wooden house, and it's a fantastic project for social ecological housing. So we have the alternatives, but in the moment they are the exception. They have to be the rule. So there are some options for regulation and incentives, and I have to concentrate on 2 because time is running out. We have CO2 pricing, we have building codes. Public procurement is very important. Public finance, taxation, grants and credits. In Germany, if you burn wood, you have to pay 7% VAT. If you use it for construction, 90%. Idiotic regulation. Research and development. I will start with CO2 pricing and will speed up. We have different CO2 pricing models. In Germany, I was the negotiator for the CO2 pricing system, and we implemented a system that after 2027, where only such much permissions are given for the emissions for the transport sector and for the housing sector, as the goal is in our climate protection law. So this will work after this, and there's a clear perspective that in 2045, there will be no allowance be on the market. So this means that there will be a total ban on fossil fuels in 2045 under the law we have in the moment, but we have every 5 years there must be a review. Maybe we have to be faster because of the climate crisis. But what does this mean? CO2 pricing will come to an end, because if we don't burn any fossil fuel, it has to come to an end. So CO2 pricing, and this is very important, is a bridge to the ban. It's a bridge to the ban. If we don't want to burn any fossil fuels, CO2 pricing systems makes no sense. And another conclusion is that there should be no dependency on the money from the CO2 pricing, because we need to stop the CO2 emissions as fast as possible. So if you construct a system of dependencies on this money, we never phase out. So, and the last remark is that the implementing of a CO2 pricing system takes time and is critical. You heard the European Parliament didn't agree in a CO2 pricing system yesterday. So it's a complicated regulation, and it's not what can we say, the silver bullet to solve every problem. It makes sense, but it's not the silver bullet, and it will come to an end. We need a ban. And building codes is another topic. We could talk hours about building codes. The best building codes in Europe are the building codes, on my perspective, from my cooperative background, are the climate house rules in South Tyrol. I won't. You can read about it, but in the moment, most buildings codes in the world do not regulate the material, and this is a big problem, because the life cycle approach in the regulation in the moment doesn't work, but it is possible. We have to have a life cycle approach. And in the near future, we have to have a strict goal that every new building must be carbon positive in a life cycle accounting. But this means a combination of carbon neutral materials, I told you before, but we need a step-by-step plan to create a climate-friendly supply chain, including production and industry. This is important. If we don't do this, we won't succeed. And now to my conclusion. We have to have a strict regulation, a simple regulation, and no loopholes. And we can learn, on my perspective, from the German Renewable Energy Source Act. It regulates electrons, and the clear target is 100% renewable electricity in the future. Why do not have a renewable material law? A step-by-step process to 100% fossil-free materials, for example, to start in the construction sector and in the chemical industry, and to create a safe haven for investments to reach this goal, because this is really important and it has to be a goal over the whole life cycle, the whole life cycle approach, inclusive of the transport sector. And this might be a perspective that works, this might be a perspective for a clear regulation, and if you have a complicated regulation, all these lawyers from the fossil industry will find the loopholes, and I'm not interested in loopholes for them because this doesn't make sense. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Klaus. Any comments? Wolf?
Bjarke has said this afternoon, and Klaus, I think sustainability is nothing for brochures and nice announcement. We need hard KPIs, which are achieved or not achieved. And that's why regulation is so important, because regulation is setting the KPIs. And I think you, Klaus, you have shown that regulation can be good and can be better. And I think if we are aligned here that we have a big issue, we have to solve it. I think the alignment is here. We have to learn that we have to define the right KPIs and we have to define the right regulation. And if this group is focusing also to find the right regulation, I think we are achieving a lot.
Andrea.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I would like to ask if you ever consider to be also influencing the laws related to taxations, since we should be assuring that we can be delivering this new built environment, if we focus on the built environment, also to people that maybe potentially cannot afford it, and how to enable new business models that maybe even renting of certain parts of the building would be possible. As an example, why not just to rent the windows and not buy them, just as a trigger to think beyond just one focus of the legislation, which is related to carbon emissions. Thank you.
Do you want to reply, Klaus, quickly?
I agree with Wolf Buch. So we had a lot of discussions because we are both from we come from the practical approach. He as a CEO, I as a member of the supervisory boards, and the rules for a small cooperative and for a big company, they are really not the same, but nearly the same. So I think you are right in your approach. And the question about taxation is a very important question. But taxation is really, really complicated, even in Germany. And in the German Bundestag, I was 8 years member of, not full member, but reserve member. I don't know if it's the right translation, in the Committee for Taxation. And I wanted to change the taxation of the use of electrification for tenants. And this was so complicated, and the former minister and leader of the Social Democratic Party 10 years ago said to me, "You won't pass a watchman at the ministry and to go in with your ideas." And in the end, we changed it. But it is really, really complicated, because if you have a single view and not an holistic approach, it's the same problem with all these other regulations. So if you have the perspective, what you want, affordable housing, not only social and affordable housing, and to construct an ecosystem that works, then it makes sense. I think maybe in this opportunity, Wolf Buch disagrees, but what the environment in Austria, in Vienna for social housing is really interesting. And even they have a tax for investments in social housing. And then to add to the social housing, the ecological aspect is simple. That's not so complicated. But if you have only free markets, this is a big problem. But we have to incentivize investments in social ecological projects, and maybe, but in Europe, this is under the regime of the member states, the VAT for social ecological housing must be lower than for other projects. This is an idea because every investment has to be positive. So, and the regulation has to help that, and we have to create an ecosphere that encourages long-term and environmentally friendly investments. But in the moment, only mostly short-term investments are encouraged. So we on our balance sheet, in our cooperative, had a lot of problems, but we started 22 years ago, but we had the city of Berlin gave a guarantee for us, so we could start. Without this guarantee, wouldn't have any chance.
One final question, but this is really the final question of the session from Liz McKeown. And a very short question and very short answer, please.
As you're considering the regulations, we cannot forget those that are responsible for implementing them. Time and again, we see that construction workers, are so used to working with existing materials, construction companies, with the building inventory they have. We have to create the incentives if we're going to make this work.
You are absolutely right. Absolutely right. And then one sentence: there are a lot of private regulations from private organizations that don't know, or what can we say? They want to incentivize products we don't need and we don't want. This is another big problem, but you are right.
Thank you very much, Klaus.